All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Medicare for All podcast. You're probably used to streaming us through your podcast player, but today we're giving you the full experience, something a little different. We're streaming live today. You're probably watching us on Facebook or YouTube or Periscope. And this is so we can see and interact with you a little bit more. And today's also our special Halloween episode. Ben and I don't usually get dressed up like this every day to go to work. But if you want to take a stab at who we are, let us know in the comments, and we'll reveal our costume inspirations at the end. So
that's a lie. We dress up like this every day, actually, for work. Working from home, you got to mix it up somehow.
We have to have some secrets, Ben.
They're all out of the bag now. They're all out. So, today, we're going to be talking about the individual mandate, which is a very wonky policy term for the requirement that you buy healthcare, which was included in the Affordable Care Act. Now, to me, like the individual mandate is one of the most bizarre and like fascinating windows onto American politics, which will explain like the strangeness and bizarreness of it. But it's also like timely because of two big things. Like there's basically two major events happening in politics right now, right? There's the Supreme Court nomination, where the Supreme Court could potentially be tipped way to the right. And then we have this, you may have heard we have an election coming up. Breaking news, news alert, there's an election coming up. And the mandate ties into both of these things, because of course, a lot of people are wondering, will this new conservative court overturn the Affordable Care Act? And it turns out the individual mandate is like at the center of that legal case. And then there's also the issue of what happens if Democrats retake Congress and the presidency. What are they going to do? Because essentially the mandate was eliminated, or they pulled the teeth out of it a couple of years ago when there was still a Republican Congress. And, you know, are Democrats going to reinstate it? What's going to happen? Is it a good or a bad thing? Let's get into it. Stephanie, you want to introduce our guest?
Sure. So we're welcoming to the podcast today, Eagan Kemp, our old friend Eagan, who is the healthcare policy advocate at Public Citizen. Happy Halloween, Eagan.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, guys.
Can we get you a better, like, sexier title than healthcare policy?
You've been working there for so long.
Yeah, maybe healthcare policy champion or something. I feel like that's like an upgrade.
We're going to work on that.
Exactly. So my first question on this episode about the individual mandate is, what the hell is an individual mandate? And specifically, how is it different from a tax?
Yeah, so an individual mandate at its most basic is the idea that you have to have health insurance. And if you don't have health insurance, there's some sort of penalty. And so it's different from a tax in that it's what you would end up paying if you didn't actually get health insurance. So if you have a health insurance, you know, you're paying for whatever your health insurance is. But if you don't have any health insurance, then it's whatever the tax is, which is generally going to be less than the cost of your health insurance, but it means you're also not getting anything and you don't actually have health insurance coverage.
Yeah, best of both worlds, really, is being uninsured and then being fined on top of it. So a lot of people who have been, you know, following this at all, the Affordable Care Act, may know that at this moment, in general, the Republican Party is opposed to the individual mandate, considers that this tax, this requirement to buy insurance is like an infringement on our personal liberties. And in general, the Democratic Party has been in favor of it, saying it's, you know, what makes the Affordable Care Act work, it's personal responsibility, yada, yada, yada. But it was not always so. Can you give us a little bit of like, where did this idea come from? How long has it been kicking around for?
Yeah, so I mean, an individual mandate is sort of a conservative way of getting people health care. I mean, as you know, we're on the Medicare for All healthcare now. That's a much more sort of progressive, it guarantees access to healthcare for folks. Whereas just an individual mandate, really the idea there is that you want people to have health insurance, and insurers are scared that if folks wait until they're sick and then just buy coverage, that means that they're only going to get, the insurers are only going to make money while people are sick, which means they're actually going to have to pay out more. And so they want them to be paying all those premiums ahead of time so that they're making their profits as they go.
We would hate for insurers not to make enough profits.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's something that has appealed to Republicans and Democrats over the years, and the health insurance industry gives pretty heavy-handedly to both, and so it's not surprising that both parties at different times would be in favor of it.
Yeah, so we're from Massachusetts, ground zero for Obamacare, actually, as you may know. The first real-life iteration of Obamacare was, of course, the Massachusetts Health Reform, which was passed on sort of a bipartisan basis under a Republican governor, Mitt Romney, who pioneered the idea under what is sort of a Democratic leadership. If you're familiar with Massachusetts state politics, you know that it's Democrat is used lightly here. President Bush, of course, also expressed really strong support for the idea of a mandate coupled with a marketplace. So if you think about the ACA as being the three legs, two of those legs, a marketplace for healthcare, and then the idea of the mandate are like major conservative ideas right there. And then, Obama, running for the Democratic primary to beat John Edwards and Hillary Clinton, he probably thought he needed to be at least a little bit to the left of the Republican governor, Romney's healthcare policy. Although both Clinton and Edwards endorsed the individual mandate in the primary. So they were apparently cool with running on Republican policy. I guess the question is, how did the Democratic solution, we have two of the three major candidates in the 2008 primary running on a Republican health reform. Like, how did that Democratic solution become like personal responsibility?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that sort of speaks to some of the challenges that I think we're going to face under a potential Biden administration. The idea that if you have sort of a national healthcare system, Medicare for all, that's much easier for folks to sort of get their heads around. But if you have, right now our system is sort of based on various fragments. There's, your basic private healthcare, there's Medicare for seniors, there's Medicaid for low income folks. And so it seemed like Democrats were less afraid of sort of tinkering with the system, trying to make some way of expanding coverage. They were more afraid of sort of taking on, insurers and hospitals directly. And so they figured that the easiest way out was to sort of take this personal responsibility option, try to tack on a new private insurance system, and hope that it ended up covering people. As we saw, there were some coverage gains, but the gaps in the system meant way too many people were still falling through.
And that makes so much sense that they weren't trying to placate Republicans, since zero Republicans voted for the ACA, but it was actually the industry that they, were acquiescing to.
That's right. Yeah, the industry across the healthcare system, and I still hear, center and center left wonks talking about how it was such a great thing that they did to placate the industry. And I said, my response is, well, look at where we are. We're having higher and higher costs, more and more bankruptcies. And just look at what's happening under COVID, where folks are losing their insurance at the worst possible time. We didn't fix the system. We just made a broken system slightly better, but didn't really address the needs of the American people.
Yeah, and if I could jump back to also an earlier question we had for you, which is about the difference between the mandate and taxes. Yeah. Like, if you think about Medicare, Medicare is paid for mostly through a payroll tax. Probably, if you have a traditional employer, you get your pay stub, and on it, it says how much is taken out of taxes. And one of the things on there, along with Social Security, is your Medicare tax. And I think it's about 2.5%, something like that, for the employee side, and an equal 2.5% for the employer side. And that covers you universal health care when you turn 65. So how is that paying for like universal health care through a tax different from like mandating that people buy health insurance and pay for a premium?
Yeah, it's hugely different. Just in terms of what people end up paying as a percentage of income, it's a huge challenge. That there was recently a couple progressive economists, Gabriel Saez and Emmanuel Zuckman, that were looking at this and highlighted that middle-class families are spending tens of thousands of dollars on healthcare, and it's sort of a hidden tax. So even if they have their healthcare through their job, they might think that they're only paying 2/3 of their insurance, or even a third of their insurance but they also have to factor in lost wages, that any money that your employer is also contributing, you would be getting that under a Medicare for All system. And that's one of the things that makes it so frustrating, is that some of these things that we take for granted as Americans, that we end up paying much more than comparably wealthy countries, both as a national system and individually, depending on versus if you had progressive taxation as the base.
Yeah, there's definitely the issue that, I mean, even for the middle class, people are still really exposed to high healthcare costs. And then on top of that, there's just the fundamental inequity of the system. I mean, because I don't qualify for a subsidy, I pay just as much for my healthcare premium as, Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. And I think that in itself is a major problem, because even, I'm spending a lot more of my percentage as a percentage of my income than somebody who's much wealthier than I am. And that's actually a part of the reason why the middle class actually has such high healthcare costs, because the rich aren't carrying their weight. And that's why I think, the progressive financing of single payer is sort of something that we don't really talk about that much as being a benefit of it. It's more like, oh, let's get everybody covered, which is of course the main goal of a single payer, and also equity in terms of the comprehensiveness of coverage, but also in terms of the financing system. We are the only country that finances healthcare this regressively and puts it that much on the back of middle class and working class people.
Yeah, and it's something that, studies on Medicare for All continue to show that, whether it was the RAND study that New York did or sort of national level studies, when you take a look at sort of the curve, all of a sudden under Medicare for All, under progressive taxation, middle class families would be paying less than they do now compared to what they're paying in premiums, if they're lucky enough to even have healthcare right now. Whereas it's only the wealthy that would end up actually paying more than they currently do. And it's because they would be finally paying their fair share, and you would finally have taxes where corporations are paying their fair share. I mean, Walmart alone depends on the Medicaid system to keep their workers healthy, and that's one of the reasons they are able to pay them so poorly, because they want to. And you'll even hear stories of Walmart workers giving up raises because they fear that they would lose access to Medicaid and then not be able to afford the coverage that they might have access to.
Yep. And one more thing I would highlight that is so important, the difference between a public tax and a mandate. When you think about your Medicare taxes, for example, when was the last time your Medicare taxes went up? I think it went up once in the last 20 years or something like that, and it wasn't much. And obviously there's public accountability, right? That has to be a congressional decision to change the rate you pay into Medicare system. But how often does your private premium goes up, and who decides, right? So to me, the mandate in a way is it's sort of like the government outsourcing the power of taxation to private corporations. It's sort of like, you have to pay this premium. How much do you have to pay? Well, ask this healthcare company over here, right?
Yeah, and that's what we see year after year. Premiums go up. At the same time, your networks are narrowing, your copays are going up, your deductibles are getting higher, and it's more and more challenging to, and we hear the same from businesses saying that, what they used to pay, even 10, 15 years ago for a plan, it was much easier to afford and there were better plans. Now it's continually more difficult to afford and for worse coverage.
So Eagan, just to bring it to this ACA lawsuit, which, the ACA is in the courts again, and again, the issue is over the individual mandate. So in the original Supreme Court ruling on the ACA, Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion that was that the mandate is constitutional. So can you tell us a little bit about, what this new lawsuit is about, and why do we care about it given the court's new composition?
Yeah, it's an important question, and it also goes back to the question that Ben had. Is before it was ruled constitutional because the mandate was considered a tax, so it was just sort of one more type of tax that the federal government could levy because if folks didn't have insurance. And so what then happened was in 2017, the GOP passed their Tax Scam Act, which is officially known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but we all know it was just a scam to to allow wealthy people to pay less in taxes. And so they zeroed out the individual mandate. They didn't repeal the mandate. They didn't repeal sort of broader ACA stuff. They just zeroed that out. And so now the question is, where there is no longer sort of that taxation piece, the penalty itself is zero, does that mean the rest of the law is now unconstitutional? And some lower courts have said yes, other ones have said no, and that's how it's reached the Supreme Court. And it's also one of those strange cases where the players involved have switched. At one point, the federal government was defending it, but then they gave up on it. And so now it's the U.S. House of Representatives, the Democrats, as well as a number of Democratic state AGs. And that's why the name is now Texas versus California.
And so what, everyone's now looking at the Supreme Court composition. Is this likely to come up again? Is this case kind of working its way through the courts and is likely to end up at the Supreme Court? Or what are people worried about this?
Yeah, so actually the oral arguments for this begin November 10th, right after the election. and back
Can I breathe?
Yeah, no, it's going to be rough. And back before the passing of RBG, the assumption was that they would push it until the next term. There was even some discussion originally that they were going to have the hearings earlier and then just sort of not have delivered a decision by the election, because Roberts is acutely aware that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny around this decision and doesn't want the court to look sort of out of place or out of step in as he's tried to sort of, they have a number of conservative decisions, but then they also have ones that are surprisingly centrist or where they're not going as far as we would anticipate. But now, since today, Amy Coney Barrett's likely to be confirmed, all of a sudden we have a situation where that conservative majority is even stronger. And so this gets to sort of a number of other issues of ways that it could fall out, most of which are range from slightly scary to absolutely terrifying.
And what's the terrifying range? Is that just totally overturning the Affordable Care Act, or?
Yes,
because the argument, right, is that the individual mandate is not legal, or the second one revolved around them not enforcing it, right, or something like that.
Yeah.
What's the argument to repeal it, and what's the worst case scenario that happens?
Yeah. So where we are now, it comes down to sort of a technical legal term called severability, and so what's
fun.
It is a lot of fun. And so the basic idea there is, can you rule certain parts of a law unconstitutional without making the entire law unconstitutional? And so the basic idea that the court has often used is, what was the congressional intent? So would Congress have preferred to have the law continue to exist absent the part that they strike down? So in this case, the individual mandate, or does the whole law have to go? This is an area where both Kavanaugh and Roberts have issued some rulings on severability that indicate they might be willing to do something like this for the individual mandate. So sort of best case scenario of the bad cases is they just rule the individual mandate unconstitutional, but leave the rest of the law alone. A sort of slightly worse outcome was they, declare it the individual mandate unconstitutional, as well as other parts of the ACA, including some aspects of the marketplaces, including some subsidies, and then obviously the most terrifying in terms of just the amount of implications it would have would be just declaring the entire ACA unconstitutional.
Yeah, as you're saying this, my head is spinning, as always, with sort of the simplicity of Medicare for all, but just also on the flip side of that, like the complexity of not doing Medicare for all. Because I think that we as a society have, decided, the left says it just straight up, that healthcare is a human right. And even if the right doesn't really want to admit it, they sort of like respect the borders and the new, terrain that most people think that you should be able to have healthcare even if you can't, afford it, or that you should get help from the government for affording it. And so what we're doing, we're saying that healthcare is a human right. All of us say it. And then to get there, instead of, instituting a government plan, which is the only way that you can deliver a right. Markets can't deliver us rights. We instead decide to torture the market and the existing system, with mandates, then regulations, then subsidy schemes to help it, to help people afford it, to deliver, basically what only the public sphere can do, deliver our rights.
Well, and I think that's one of the things looking back at how the ACA was passed is they built one of the key parts of the system on the private insurance system, which is the most fundamentally flawed and most challenging to sort of justify. I mean, just look at what's happening with COVID right now. Insurance companies are making record profits at the time. The fear right now is that they're not going to meet what they call the medical loss ratio, where they have to spend 80% of the money they take in on actual care. But if they go too high, then their shareholders are like, no, you shouldn't be giving this much care. And if you go too low, then they have to pay back money to folks that were paying premiums. And so building a huge chunk of the ACA on that was always going to be problematic. Whereas when you look at Medicare over time, absent Medicare Advantage, it's very difficult to attack Medicare. Even the Trump administration, when they've threatened to, have often sort of pulled back at the last minute because they know there would be a rebellion against it. Whereas with private insurers, there's so many more gaps and challenges, and it's like pushing a noodle. It's not easy to get folks to be as fired up in the same way.
So I guess this is an interesting question. Given that we have now lived 2 years without the individual mandate being enforced, my memory is that it was in like December 2017. It was like Republicans had just lost all the elections in the House. They knew they were losing the House, and they're like, oh shit, what do we pass before we lose control of the House? And they kind of rushed through all these tax cuts you were talking about, and also zeroing out the mandate fine. But Democrats have been saying now for years, and this was actually part of the legal case, well, you can't have the rest of the Affordable Care Act without the individual mandate. They're saying, well, young and healthy people are going to refuse to buy private insurance. They're going to, assume they'll be fine. And without the money of those young, healthy people, the premiums will go up for everyone else. And the whole system will collapse if you don't have this mandate. What has been the actual lived experience of people, both when we had the mandate before, but then also these last 2 years without the mandate, but we still have everything else? We have the subsidies, we have the Medicaid expansion, all that stuff.
Yeah, so far we're not seeing sort of the death spiral that it was called before. That the idea that it would lead to lots of people dropping insurance if there was no sort of mandate or no penalty for the mandate. So we're not seeing that. I mean, even sort of looking back to when the mandate was happening, it was never more than sort of 10% of people in any given county or part of the country. It was typically only less than 5% of people were actually paying the penalty in any given year. So it was already relatively small, but the problem was that of the folks paying the penalty, a lot of them were lower income. So there are a number of hardship exemptions, not as sort of relevant now, but you still have to go to either fill out paperwork or sort of understand, go to one of the government websites or get sort of help from one of the hotlines, but it was never particularly easy. And so the fact that it's gone away hasn't had sort of those negative effects but thinking long term, there still could be challenges there. But again, most of it is for sort of private insurers, which are not feeling particularly. No one's feeling particularly amenable to them at this point. So I don't think there's a lot of sympathy.
So to recap here, Republicans invent the idea of the individual mandate, like the Heritage Foundation writes all these papers. But they can't get it implemented anywhere until Democrats implement it in Massachusetts along with Mitt Romney. And then Obama and Congress, fully Democratic Congress, embrace the individual mandate. It becomes a Democratic idea that they say is necessary for the whole lot of work. The Republicans say is terrible as a violation of individual liberties. And then it gets repealed by Republicans who invented the idea the first time, and nothing happens. Is that about right?
Ben, when you say it like that, it makes it sound absurd. But that is right, and I think that's what's so terrifying about sort of the series of decisions that led here. And one of the scariest things is Republicans don't know what to do next. This was their idea. This is That's why Trump every 2 weeks says in 2 weeks he's going to have some sort of healthcare plan. It's why people inside the White House said one of the things he asked was, why can't we just put everyone on Medicare? And so it's like he doesn't understand what's actually happening in the healthcare system. And Republicans aren't sure where to go next. They don't have a specific plan other than repealing the ACA, which they just sort of see as more of a political move as opposed to a policy move.
Wow. That was bleak. All right. Well, if Biden wins and Congress falls to the Democrats, reinstating the individual mandate is probably on the table. What do you think will happen in a Biden administration? Will they try to reinstate the mandate, especially as the ranks of the uninsured continue to grow? And where do we stand on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I imagine they will try to if they did it, it would be as part of some sort of, ACA 2.0 package or sort of COVID package where there's sort of a number of tweaks. Some things that we might end up liking is, higher subsidies for folks that right now struggle, either requirements for states to cover folks through Medicaid in a way that they're not required to do so now, but a mandate is, I think, will be at least part of the consideration. At this point, now that we are seeing that it's not having as big of an effect, I think there's much more of a debate to be had about whether, who we're protecting with an individual mandate, are death spirals real, and why aren't we actually pushing for a healthcare system that guarantees people have access to the healthcare they need, as opposed to paying for healthcare that's really only lining the pockets of insurance companies. And I think we're in a much stronger position to have that debate. I mean, we're seeing folks lose their jobs. One of the only things that's come up from Congress is using COBRA and paying a ton of money to have limited coverage, as opposed to using one of the plans that Senator Sanders put out, the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act, or a plan by Representative Jayapal, Medicare Crisis Program Act, both of which would ensure coverage much more comprehensively and much more cheaply than just doing COBRA alone.
Is there appetite among Democrats to get the individual mandate back up?
Not on its own. I mean, I think a lot of people are still amenable to the arguments made that you could have a worse, what they call a risk pool over time, where I think a number of I've heard some health policy folks say that people just don't know that the individual mandate's gone, and so are maybe keeping health insurance when they don't necessarily need to. But as we're discussing sort of what the future of healthcare is, how much political capital should be spent just redoing things that didn't end up closing the gap as much as we would have liked, as opposed to things that would really close the gap or improve healthcare for the American people.
Well, that's a relief.
Yeah, well, it's a tough time to be a resident in America with coronavirus spiraling out of control, but it appears to be a great time to be an insurance company, because imagine selling a product where the government requires people to buy your products. You could be like a car manufacturer and government requires people to buy your car. I mean, I can't think of any other area of life where this kind of happens, where it's like a linking of public requirements with private products and private merchandise and profits. So it's tough. And I wanted to kind of close the conversation with this international perspective also, because a lot of things we hear, I lived through this whole thing in Massachusetts where they were first debating putting it in place, and they did it. And a lot of people were pointing to Switzerland and Netherlands, and they're like, oh yeah, this is how some countries achieve universal health care. I'm going to ask, because I know Stephanie's done a lot of research on this also, but Eagan first and then Stephanie, true or false, is this a pathway to universal healthcare, to just keep that mandate, make it really strong, and then somehow make it more affordable for people to buy private insurance?
It is a pathway, but it's not the right pathway.
Good, succinct answer.
Yeah.
Stephanie?
Sure. I mean, I'll go on a little bit longer, unfortunately. So there are a couple of countries that have tried this route, notably the Netherlands and Switzerland. And Switzerland actually has the most privatized, where most of the financing of the insurance system is based off of premiums, whereas in the Netherlands it's like kind of a mix. But essentially in Switzerland, what they're finding now is that the Swiss and actually even the WHO and international observers are questioning whether Switzerland has a universal healthcare system anymore, because so many people have fallen through the cracks. They've, stopped paying their premiums, or, for whatever reason, and they've just dropped out of the system altogether to such an alarming percentage that they may not actually constitute a universal healthcare system anymore. And so I think that, and of course, not only is it not universal, but it's also the most regressively financed healthcare system in all of Europe. The Swiss have, but it's all Switzerland is like a haven for rich people. So
send your money to Switzerland, not your body. Keep your body in another European country.
Well, and that's, you look at those two countries, and the Netherlands had in recent years had more of a move to privatize aspects of their healthcare system, and there's now a backlash against it where people want to go back in the public direction, because as they privatize more, their healthcare system has costed more and has led to more unmet need. And Switzerland was already among European countries the most expensive, and as you pointed out, the one that had sort of the least universal coverage. It's sort of, you look at why Medicare for All is so popular. The only universal coverage system in America that sort of that we see work in similar ways to European countries is Medicare, where seniors have universal coverage. And once people hit 65, all of a sudden their health improves, and they start moving towards some of their European cohort. But up until 65, it's sort of a wild, wild west in the U.S. It really varies sort of where you live, your access, what your job is, in a way that you just don't see that level of unmet need in other high-income countries.
Yeah, and I think what I've learned from Stephanie is that in the Netherlands, the mandate, you're only paying a very small portion of the actual cost of your care as a premium. So people, I think maybe that they're paying for their whole healthcare with like a mandated premium.
They literally think that their healthcare costs €120 a month.
Right. But the rest of it is paid for through taxes. So really, there is no fully universal system, I think, that's built on mandates and private health insurance, for-profit insurance. Definitely, there's no for-profit in these countries. So you do need something with a public taxation system and universal entitlement to really get to healthcare as a right and not to have healthcare costs like ruining the rest of our economy. But thank you so much for joining us, Eagan. Stephanie, we should probably explain our costumes now that people have had half an hour to get confused by them.
Yes.
What are you dressed as, Stephanie?
Come on, y'all. No anime fans here. I'm Princess Mononoke, darling of the Miyazaki universe.
Totally missed that reference.
Okay.
Wrong audience. Eagan, can you tell what I am?
It's too dark. I can't see.
All right. Well, let me show you my glorious t-shirt here. See, there's like a universe there. So it's a universal healthcare.
Very on brand. I like it.
I wish I was clever enough to have
the
thought
conceptual
of this myself,
costume. Yeah, that's
too
deep for me.
All right. Well, this was great, exciting. This is our very first video version of video podcast.
Yay! Thanks everyone.
Podcast.
Podcast.
Have a great one, y'all. We're looking forward to the next one in a couple of weeks.
Happy Halloween.
Thanks, Eagan.
Thanks for having me.
Bye, guys.